and the financial services would be highlighted by our eminent experts. I am stepping in as a proxy for Mr. Lakshmi Kumaran to make these introductory remarks, because Mr. Lakshmi Kumaran has been, he is appearing, he's actually on his legs, but these days on laptop, you are not actually on your legs. You may be sitting and addressing the Honorable Court. He's appearing before the Karnataka High Court at the moment. So he called me up because he was very much concerned as to, because he's the session chairperson. I said, don't worry, I will share, this with the other panelists. And I would suggest that Mr. Amit Gupta, the Executive Vice President and National Head, Institutional Businesses of SBI Funds Management Private Limited, will chair the session or moderate the session, whichever way the panelists would like. We also have very distinguished speakers like Mr. Tapan Sehgal, Managing Director and CEO of one of the topmost corporate bodies in the field of insurance, general insurance, that is Bajaj Allianz General Insurance Company Limited. And no panel is complete without an eminent lady speaker. And we have Ms. Bhavna Sangwan, as the head of payments. Women are directly connected with payments, and more with payments than with receipts of the payment amounts, So she is the most appropriate person to give his views, along with then Mr. Anuj Kalia, who is partner of Kochar & Company, one of the topmost law firms known not just in India, but overseas also. They have their offices in Dubai, Chicago, and other places. And then there will be a special address by Mr. William Block, Treasury Attaché, US Embassy. So we have our hands full and very eminent speakers. So with these, I hand over the proceedings now to Mr. Amit Gupta. Over to you, Amit.
Thank you, Mr. Bhasin, and good evening, everyone. Thanks a ton for having us here for this esteemed panel, and where we can speak about, elucidate about the opportunities what we have from the BFSI segment and more so asset management industry which we represent. So just to give you a perspective about the asset management industry and the kind of practices we follow, we can proudly say that this is one industry where our standard operating practices or disclosure norm are at best or amongst the best as far as the global standards are concerned. When we speak about the industry per se, we are managing roughly 37 trillion rupee kind of assets under management. And just to give you a perspective about the banking industry, which is at 140 trillion. So when we speak about asset management companies, there are many opportunities, there are challenges also, but these are the two sides of the same coin. The challenges what we face on the asset management side or the mutual fund specifically is on the awareness part. The penetration still is into single digits. There is also a tendency amongst Indian investor to go for a fixed coupon kind of a return, which mutual fund as per the regulation cannot offer. And the another part is about the misconception that mutual funds are only equity mutual fund. The asset management industry, the kind of services what we are providing is to work as a money manager to each of the country residents, whether on the individual side or on the company side. And we are here to provide investment or treasury solutions right from the monies which are from 1 day to your retirement corpus. That is the wide array of services what we offer. As I mentioned, the industry per se on the mutual fund side is 37 trillion rupees, and on the other private space, which is AIF and PMS, it is another 20 trillion rupees. So in totality, 57 trillion rupee is the size of the industry. When we speak about SBI Mutual Fund, the company which I represent, we are the #1 company in the industry, managing roughly 6.5 trillion rupees on the mutual fund space. and roughly 8 trillion rupees on the PMS and AI space, which means 14.5 trillion rupees is something what we are managing as of now. So it might be looking as a big number when we speak about these 37 trillion or another 20 trillion on the private space. But when we look at the potential and when we look at the data points of the global scale, so just to give you a perspective, the global GDP at this point of time is roughly 82 trillion dollars, while the mutual fund industry or asset management industry is roughly $100 trillion, which means that the asset management industry globally is more than the GDP, the global GDP, or for that matter, when we speak global context, the asset management industry is bigger than the banking industry. And when we come to India, while mutual fund industry or asset management industry is only 25% of the banking segment or 13-14% of the GDP. So it only shows the kind of potential what it has. What we are trying to do through our body, which is Association of Mutual Fund of India, AMFI, is to bring awareness, run a campaign whereby we are just trying to percolate this point or propagate a point that rather than managing your money directly, it is better you come through the mutual fund route. We have solutions, strategies for each kind of investment or short-term parking. And if you look at the track record of the funds, we are making sure that we are trying to cater to whatever return expectations which investor has, at the same time managing risk. At SBI Mutual Fund, we give a lot of credence on managing risk part, and the advantages what we look at is the kind of sheer diversity which asset management industry offer, the kind of regulatory disclosures what we are doing, the ease through which we are managing the investment of our investor is something which is going a long way. Indian investors are more favorably inclined towards the asset management industry, and that is the reason we keep on reading that retail investors are coming in drove. Every month in India, retail investors are pumping in 10,000 crore kind of money into a stock market through the mutual fund route, and that could be one of the reasons why markets are doing so well. We at this point of time are not that dependent on the FII money, and look at the resilience of our domestic investor. Still, as I mentioned, it is only into a single digit investors percentage which is investing into mutual fund. We have a long way to go. But as Dr. Bhasin mentioned, for any economy, especially economy of our size, if we have to become a developed economy, reach a $5 trillion kind of a dollar kind of a size, financial industry has to play a very, very integral role, and within which asset management industry has a very important significance in making sure that we are providing the best of the financial solutions to all our stakeholders. With this, I will rest my address and we will move to the other participants. We have Mr. Singhal, who is the MD and CEO of Bajaj Allianz General Insurance. He is an industry veteran with 30 years kind of experience. We will like to hear from him what kind of opportunities or challenges what are there in the industry and how is he navigating all those. Over to you, Mr. Singhal.
Thank you, Amit. I think it's really good listening to you on the mutual fund sahi hai. I think it's really doing good. Okay, coming to insurance, I think insurance is pretty interesting. Let me give you some interesting facts so we understand how interesting it is. If I look at insurance typically, and if I speak of general insurance industry in India, it has a combined ratio close to 115 to 120%, which means that for every 100 rupees earning, outgo is close to 115 or to 120 for the past now from 2007 for the past 14-15 years. Which means that the industry really pays claim very well, because it's beyond what it should be able to afford as paying claim. But from the pricing perspective, it's very priced well and pays claim well. But you ask somebody on the street what's their view on insurance, they would say these guys don't pay claims. But it's a very funny statement. Yeah, the fact shows that the industry is paying claims really well, but the perception is not so. That's the first point. The second point is the cost of insurance. I think I have such eminent panelists, such well-read, such knowledgeable people, very digital, the best in class. If I ask them how many of them actually have a retail cyber insurance for themselves, they can raise their hand, or they can say, speak out here. None, yeah. And the cost of a retail cyber insurance will cover phishing, malware, stalking, you name it, anything that is not, I think the lower end is 7 rupees for a year. Can you beat that? Yeah. But and it's such high risk today. Like when you pick up newspaper, anything, all these frauds happening, all this malware, phishing, or cyber ransom, you hear about it. It's a real threat, and I think it has moved up by thousands of percentage points in lockdown, and people are losing money continuously. But if you ask, and all those listening to it, just ask you this question: do you have a retail cyber insurance cover for yourself as an individual? I'm very surprised if somebody says yes. No. Okay, now let me, if I again ask a very simple question, that how much do you think a 1 lakh rupee cover, just to give an idea, would cost for a year from a personal accident perspective? That is, an accidental death perspective. The premium cost is 40 rupees a year for 1 lakh, which means that if you talk of 10 lakhs, you're talking of just what, 400 rupees a year. You're talking of less than, like close to about a rupee or 1.5 rupee per day kind of, per 10 lakh cover. So the affordability is also there. So I'll give you another interesting statement now. If you look at in the COVID time, a cover for COVID, which anybody can get COVID, and the premium is about 607 rupees a year, and the cover would be very comfortable. So if you get let's say the average cost of COVID treatment is about 2 lakh rupees in a hospital. So for that you're paying about 600 rupees, no underwriting. Just some waiting period for 15 days or 1 month, depending on the policy condition. 3 clicks, you can buy your policy, and the cost is just about 600, which means that everybody and anybody should be having that cover, because nobody knows who'll get COVID, and that's the treatment. In India, if you look at health insurance, about 30-40 crore below poverty line is covered by the government schemes. About 10-15 crores are covered by insurance companies. For a population of 130 crores, we're talking about 75 crore people not covered by health. And we're not talking of poor people below poverty line. That's already covered by government. Yeah? We're talking of people who can afford comfortably a couple of rupees per day, which meant that about 70 crore people should have bought the Corona policy, which is easily available on any website, costing about, let's say, 2 rupees, 3 rupees a day. And any Corona, straight through process, 2 clicks. But it doesn't happen. So the funny part of insurance is it is required by everybody. The risks are high, prevalent. But when the house is on fire, then we realize that we require a policy. It's too late. If your house is already burning, you can't get a fire insurance for that now. And the cost is hardly anything. In fact, I remember a lot of our Indian parents, especially mother, tells us that save money for the rainy day. But technically, if you actually have bought insurances, which will cost much less than the savings that you have, you actually spend money and have a great time yourself, and be actually very secure. Instead of trying to save in all your money and cutting down on all your trips, cutting down all that you wanted to have in life, because saving for rainy day can be easily covered by insurance. So the challenge here is not about the product, the pricing, the need. The challenge here is that most of us, and it's across the world, not only for India, don't perceive that things can go wrong for us. Ability to see risk is very, very low. I think that is something which is there. And it's good for the human civilization, because if we were too obsessed about risk, maybe we not stepped out of caves. So I think that is fine. And this is precisely why I think the insurance need comes at the last requirement, which is fine. Now, one way is you try addressing people, talk to them, attend forums, convey that, okay, this is the pricing, this is the product, it's very much required for you. Other is, if you look at across the world, if I look at insurance penetration, and the role of government is very interesting. If you look at, let us say, in India, now motor insurance is mandatory by law. Motor third party is mandatory by law. If you don't have it, the police checks, and if you don't have it, you have a challan. This is because it's mandatory by law to have an insurance cover. So the motor insurance penetration in India would be very high. There are countries where it is not mandatory by law to have insurance of motor. In those countries, the insurance penetration of motor is very, very low. So I think, again, the problem is that when the government steps in, and why is it mandatory for motor insurance to be there? What is the benefit that the government gets if motor is mandatory? I don't think there's any benefit of the government. The issue is that if somebody dies in a motor accident or somebody gets hurt, the liability in India is unlimited, which means I can say that for a scooter claim, a two-wheeler claim, I have a 15 crore claim, because somebody got killed by a two-wheeler. So do we owning a two-wheeler realize that if we're not insured, there can be liability of 15 crores on us. We would be thinking if this tool is not insured, okay, it may cost me about 10,000 rupees, 20,000 rupees to repair, but it can lead to 15 crore liability on us, no? Because the unlimited liability on third party is there in India. And that is why it is mandatory by law to have an insurance cover. Because if your vehicle meets an accident, somebody dies or somebody gets injured, there's a huge liability which comes through. And if you can't afford it, then the poor guy who has died or somebody who's got grievously injured does not get the requisite support. It's a societal requirement that you be insured that if something goes wrong, a compensation can be paid to the person, so his family is not left in the dark. So insurance has a huge societal role to play, and that is why this mandatory thing comes into picture. Okay, the other thing, let's say look at below poverty line, the health cover. So by the Prime Minister's scheme, 40 crore Indians below poverty line got covered, national health scheme. What's the impact of that on the Indian average life expectancy? Have you ever thought about it? If 40 crore Indians get covered by health insurance, the average life expectancy of Indians will move up by 5 to 7 years. Why? Simply because one of the reasons why expectancy comes down, let's say if I look at expectancy in Uganda, it will be close to 40 plus. In Japan is 90 plus. The difference is healthcare and access to healthcare. The moment you have 5 lakh sum insured in the hands of people, even in the remotest corner of India, suddenly the healthcare, you watch all these people talking about moving to tier 2, tier 3, all the big hospital chains and others, because they realize that now people can afford good treatment. So immediately there's expansion of healthcare and health services across the country. The fallout is such that healthcare moves, expansion moves up, you have more infrastructure coming in, which means the average life expectancy of Indians move up by 5 to 7 years. A simple thing like covering people below poverty line by a good sum insured for health moves up the average expectancy of Indians. Now that is when the government steps in again and does that part. Let's look at pandemic. Are we aware that we have a terrorism pool? So when the Bombay incident happened, actually the insurance companies paid out for the entire terrorist activity which happened. On a pandemic also, if a pool gets created, then all the issue of migrant laborers moving out in the beginning and all the trauma that was suffered when the lockdown happened, and also to some extent led to the spread of the virus, could have been avoided if people had cover for pandemic. And it was already present. It was before the pandemic struck also. Wimbledon, we all heard about it. They had this pandemic cover, and with pandemic cancellation, huge amount of claims got paid out. Even today, if a pool gets created a pandemic, where the government and the insurance companies chip in, then actually if a pandemic strikes again, then all the standing charges, that means the salary of people or the expenses for a factory, even when it's closed, gets paid. Which means that all the migrant laborers, all the employees, no layoff happens. People keep their job, which does not lead to an economic crisis, which does not lead to a trauma being held, or being people moved anywhere. So insurance, again, to some data, like my friend when he mentioned about mutual funds, insurance are the biggest contributor to the government money in terms of infrastructure development. I think most of the money of insurance companies have to be put into government things. So are you aware that I think about 1/6 of the total money which is deployed in the government comes from insurance companies, which is there in lines of lakhs of crores. Are we aware that insurance industry is the largest employer of people? About 6 million people get directly employed, and indirectly, would run into very comfortably about 20 million people or so. Are we aware that the insurance industry, when a crisis happens, be it floods or be it cyclones, are the biggest bail? I remember my own company, Valiant Generations company, when Srinagar flood happened. In Srinagar, we have 50% market share. When Srinagar flood happened, we gave out close to 1,200 crores in just 3 months' time and paid money door to door, while the entire money which came in from other sources were not equivalent to 300 crores. Insurance companies are the biggest bailout in terms of when things go wrong. So the challenge here is, one, our thinking that it cannot go wrong for us, and the cost of it is incidental and very small. That is something we should be addressing it. And second is government intervention. Looking at a much higher scale, creating a pandemic pool is something which has to be done, where it benefits the society at a much larger scale. It benefits us individuals much larger scale than what you can think about. Over to you, Amit. This is my first.
Thank you, Mr. Singhal, and which is what we are also very, very constructive on general insurance or insurance as a segment. And as we spoke about mutual fund, similarly, the penetration levels are far lower than Southeast Asian peers, rather than mentioning any other developed economies. So a long way to go, but full of opportunities. That is how we look at. Now we will move to Ms. Bhavna Sangwan. She represents a space which is very much hot, and we keep on discussing about the electronic payment system, UPI being one of our indigenous payment mechanism, which is creating records. Bhavna has a experience of around decade and a half into this particular field, along with legal and compliance. Bhavna, we want to understand from you, how is payment thing picking up, and how are you guys servicing the Indian consumer in terms of having a seamless experience while making payments? Over to you, Bhavna.
Sure. Thank you, Amit. And thanks, Tapan, for a great insight on the insurance bit. Really very helpful. And I completely agree on one point, which is whenever the government come into the picture, I think the things move at a very, very fast pace. So I think taking a clue from that, before we get into the details of payments, I would say that, India represents the second highest population in the world, coupled with the almost 80% of the total Indians who are actually earning and spending in cash. Until recently, the cash counted for approximately 95% of the total retail transaction. Less than 3% of the Indians actually hold a credit card, right? So over a period of time, the governments and banks have actually driven a lot of bank opening exercise under the financial inclusion in order to get more and more Indian customers to have access to the formal banking channel and operations. So over the last 10 to 15 years, we have seen that more than 80% of the Indian customer actually have a bank account. And mostly these banks are used either for the purpose of withdrawing the cash for the money they have received from government under various subsidies, or they're actually lying dormant. The real challenge then, which the government had, 5 years back, was actually to have these dormant accounts digitally active. That is how exactly we should try and involve and promote the digital transaction. And the results that we see today is, just the outcome of multiple year efforts. So I would say that today, at this point in time, the last 10 years for the payment industry have been really disruptive and innovative. We have witnessed a phase where the government, regulator, bank, service provider, and even the customer are encouraging and adopting the digital payments. Today, India is ranked #1 in the world digital payments with 25.5 billion real-time payment transactions, followed by China with almost 15.7 billion transactions. So at this stage, India is leading the retail transaction, and this journey has not been easy, right? If we start, this actually journey started when the telco penetration started in India, right? So today, India is the second highest mobile adopter. Indian citizens have the highest penetration of the internet also. The internet reaches, to the tier 2 and tier 3, and India is a very unique country with the lowest possible telco rates. And this is actually the rate rolls that was provided for Indian customers to actually, move forward with an innovative product on the digital payments. And this was, I was fortunate to work with one of the telcos. And what we realized was that if you identify the corridors, from where actually the calls are landing from one state to another state, ideally, we see the same pattern being replicated in the financial sector also, because those are actually the friends and relatives, and those are the corridors where actually the payments are moving in the banking sector also. Right? At that time, the banks were struggling, where even a check used to take more than 5 to 6 working days in order to clear, versus today, where is actually a real-time payments. And in between that, the telco infrastructure was leveraged, and in early 2010, two things happened simultaneously. The first was that e-commerce came in the country, which equipped Indian customers to actually do a very complex e-commerce transaction. Buying any product after all the search, comparing with various other websites, and placing an order is far more complex than actually a digital payment that is being done. But the gap that exists at that point in time was all about the security, about the trust that I have, and will my account will be defrauded, So there was a complete gap on the digital front, on the trust, security, and the convenience side. So in the initial phase of the e-commerce, we saw that most of the transaction that was placed was all on the COD. It was all cash on delivery. Over a period of time, I think the regulation also played a very critical role. The Payments and Settlement Act that was issued in 2019 for the first time allowed the non-banking entities to participate in the payment sector. And one of the key achievements, along with multiple other non-banking entities coming in, was the incorporation of NPCI, National Payment Corporation of India, which is a very unique model, which is about all the banks owning it, but also leveraging the banks to their strength and also allowing the non-banking entities to come with the best possible innovative solution in order to offer a more seamless way of transacting. So, there were various innovation that came up. The sandbox as a regulation was allowed by RBI. Today I would say that, sandbox is a one part, but the kind of experiments that is happening in India in order to solve this digitization is unprecedented anywhere in the world. So on one side, India has all the problem of payments, where you have every tier of the customer from the topmost to the people who are residing in the rural India. Simultaneously, every digital commerce which is booming at this stage, whether it's a content related or it is e-commerce or any other business, even for that matter, over-the-counter shops today are willing to get into online stores. And at the junction where the e-commerce or we can say the proposed customer becomes the customer is actually the payments link. So it is a very critical junction, and it is important for the customers to adopt those digital payments. And for that, the innovation that has happened in last 2-3 years has given a lot of push. From an NPCI standpoint, I think UPI has been a clear winner. We all know the convenience that it brings. But the real factor in the UPI was that the existing asset, which is IMPS and RTGS that existed between the various banks, they were given a wrapper, of a convenience, trust, and security by a non-banking entity. So this is like an example where the strength of both the world, whether it's a non-banking entities or a bank, can come together and create the product which can take India to a different level in the world platform. That has really helped. And simultaneously, I would say that the demonetization as well as COVID is a point, which has forced the Indian customers to adopt the digital payments. During the demonetization time, the kind of uptake that we have seen in Indian customers was unprecedented, and the same is being followed during the COVID time period also. One of the trends that we have also seen is that payments is leading to the consumption. It's not the other way around, right? So like Mr. Bhasin mentioned, it's more about the consumption that is linked with the payment, and there are a lot of cashback, there are a lot of offers. There is also a sort of a marketing that is attached and tagged to the payments. So while the real objective of all this is to ensure that the customer who is transacting on the cash should actually come in the digital payment flow. And just as a data point, the cash is very expensive as compared to the digital payments. So the cash handling cost, if we see on an average in India, the cash handling cost is almost 4% as compared to the digital payments, which come almost around 2%. And in case of a UPI, it is zero at the present, because of the RBI mandate. We have also seen that there are a lot of other fintech that came in last 2 years beyond UPI in order to take the payments to the next level. So today we have a voice-based payments. Even from Amazon standpoint, I can say that there are payments which is happening over Alexa as an example, right? At this point in time, there are payments projects on which are working on sound, right? So they just by the sound and the Wi-Fi, the customer will be able to make the transaction instead of having any contact in the real offline transaction also. The payments are also made more frictionless. Even after the second factor authentication, which RBI imposed, still the regulatory enablement came. The small value, high frequency transaction was actually the main point for converting those customers into digital payments. And in that, the wallets also played a very critical role, because the customer bank account is safe. Whatever money is required to be spent, they park it in the wallet and do that small value, high frequency transaction, which inculcate a habit in the customer and also establish the trust. And for the purpose of establishing their trust, I would say that it is also an ecosystem effort that has led to where we stand today. From RBI standpoint, there are ombuds notification that has been issued. RBI has actually come up with a regulation. If there is a wrong refund or a delay in refund that has been done, then there is a penalty of 100 rupees per day that have been imposed on the banking as well as the payment licensed entities. And the Ombuds network, which was till date available only for the banking customers, is now made available for payments also. So from the customer perspective, there is a confidence that have been imparted. There is a trust and a security that has been assured. Simultaneously, from an ecosystem perspective, a lot of the non-tech, I would say, entities have played a very critical role. However, as we progress further, this is going to be a critical path for India. And as of today morning, the RBI has announced its partnership with the Singapore authorities, where UPI will be used as a rail for the purpose of the transaction, not only for person to person, even for the banks. Now this is like taking a second phase where we will be transferring and moving to a cross-border transaction, based on the systems that we have created in India. And however, the challenges, I think, from an Indian standpoint, some of them will continue, which is the first is about ensuring that the systems are fraud proof. While it cannot be ensured in 100% cases, but having a strict fraud control coupled with the systematic control over the customers' convenience will continue to be a central theme for the regulator. The last challenge, which is which we foresee more from a regulation standpoint, is about taking a calculated control over the fintech and the banking world. So ensuring that it doesn't lead to a over-regulation, right? So this is a junction where innovation and banks are coming together, but at the same time, it is important that the regulator continue to enable it instead of adding any friction in the momentum that has been created in this country at this point in time. I think that's where the things stand. In future, we believe that the payments and the fintech world will converge. Maybe after certain or many years down the line, but we believe that the payments will be the rail for providing the credit, as well as enabling the various other options for insurance, as well as the mutual fund, at least on the retail side. We have seen some of the baby steps at this point in time, where multiple multinationals as well as the Indian companies are entering into that domain. But in times to come, we believe that the asset that has been created will be utilized for almost every field of the fintech.
So thank you, Bhavna, for elucidating on the kind of opportunities which are there on the payment infrastructure. And very silently, there has been some kind of a revolution which is happening, which is leading Indians for a paradigm shift from cash-centric economy to cashless economy, and where all the fintech companies other than bank and the regulator are playing a very, very critical role. Before I move to Anuj, maybe another point which comes to each of us as a consumer is on the safety part, and you touched upon that. Maybe if you can deliberate a little further in terms of what security measures are the companies, fintech companies, taking so to make sure that frauds are avoided and the payment is going to the rightful person.
Sure, Amit. So to the extent the security is concerned, say every transaction part, so there are multiple players that are involved in the ecosystem, starting from a merchant to the acquiring bank to the issuing bank. The security is required at each leg. Now the maximum security is required, which is a systematic risk, in which I can end up having a issue at a larger ecosystem level. On that front, if it comes to the card that is being stored, then there are PCI DSS compliances that are being adopted by the organization. There are InfoSec guideline that is being issued by RBI and followed. Almost every licensed entity, as well as the other non-licensed entity in the ecosystem, are subject to CERT audit, which is periodical, and the data is submitted to RBI, there are requirements where in case there is any breach that happens, and to be very frank, as an industry, we should accept that breach will happen, right? Because there cannot be any system which is security proof 100%, right? So the fraudsters are also innovating, and they are also moving at a fast pace. But the whole point is that whenever any security issue happens, there are established processes where we need to inform not only to RBI but also to the central government. So there is a full-fledged control that is involved and implemented at this point in time. I think this is a subject which will continue to evolve, right? At any time, whenever a new threat comes, the additional measure is something that needs to be implemented.
Thank you, Bhavna. And I will only request all the participants to keep on exploring these payment gateways which are there, even for your mutual fund investment or buying a general insurance or insurance policy. We all are accepting these, payment interfaces. So thank you. Now we move to the legal about the challenges which we face on the legal side as a sector per se is growing so fast. We have Anuj Kalia, who is a partner with Kochar & Company. He has a tremendous experience on the BFSI segment. So without taking any further time, over to you, Anuj, and what are your thoughts about the challenges which we are facing and how our company is dealing with it?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thanks, Amit. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be part of this panel with such distinguished professionals. So I'll take you through a quick overview of the recent legal and regulatory developments which have taken place in the financial industry services in India. I'll try my best to not make this a boring law school lecture, and I hope it's as interesting as the other speakers. So I'd like to start with a problem which has plagued our banking industry and really shackled the tremendous economic growth which India could have achieved. I'm talking about non-performing assets or bad loans. As you're all aware, India's standalone insolvency and bankruptcy statute is 5 years old now. These 5 years have been a roller coaster ride, and every few weeks there are rulings on the interpretation and the functioning of the code. We're still in a nascent stage in fine-tuning the insolvency and bankruptcy proceedings compared to other developed nations. The most significant impact of COVID-19 in relation to the code was the government suspending the application of any fresh insolvency proceeding for a period of 1 year, commencing from March 2020 till March 2021. The pecuniary jurisdiction of IBC was increased to rupees 10 million from the existing rupees 100,000. There was also the introduction of pre-packaged insolvency resolution procedure, which is fairly common and popular in developed nations. Currently, pre-packs are permitted only for the micro, small, and medium enterprises, and only where the default is lesser than rupees 10 million. So that's quite interesting, actually, because everyone expected a big inflow of insolvency cases to hit the NCLT and the courts and really jamming the tribunals after the suspension would have been lifted in March 2021. But however, due to the increase of the pecuniary limit to 1 crore and the introduction of the pre-packs, it's been fairly stable, and we haven't really seen inflow which has really crippled the tribunals. But having said that, the tribunals have been suffering from a lack of judges more than the number of cases which are there. So that's a pain point right now in the industry, that the tribunals are really lacking heads for the system to really go ahead there. I'd like to move on to the regulations surrounding debt raised by Indian residents from foreign sources. I thought this would be relevant considering this is an Indo-US summit. So there have been numerous relaxations on the external commercial borrowing regulations. That's what they refer to when a resident Indian raises debt from overseas lender. And we've seen a constant uptick in Indian entities raising debt ever since there's been a relaxation. Although most of the debt, if you take the entire pie, most of the debt which is being raised is raised through the parent entities. And that's interesting because the regulations, in fact, made it quite simple for subsidiaries in India to raise debt from their parents overseas. So earlier, the only mechanism was by raising capital through capital infusion through equity. Now it's a lot of companies are looking at extending debt also, because it's much cheaper compared to debt in India. There's also been significant interest shown by various development financial institutions across the world investing in India. And a great example of that is the US International Development Finance Corporation, which has been significantly involved in impact lending in India. So that's another space we've been seeing a lot of debt which is being raised and hybrid instruments which are being raised in the impact financing space. So an impact financing is basically a financing which is done to really for a social or economic purpose and towards the betterment of the society at large. So it's great that there are specific platforms where you can lend for those kind of entities. I would like to move on now to one of the most exciting industries in the current ecosystem, which is fintech, and something which Bhavna is already touched upon quite a lot. But the Indian startups have really been at the forefront of innovation in the fintech space. Given the fundamentally sound and sophisticated IT companies operating in India for the past few decades now, I think everyone knows that fintech was just a natural progression to what was already there. The industry has always been a few steps ahead of the regulators, and that's how it should be, right? The industry innovates, and it's the duty of the regulator to decide whether this product or service requires regulation or not. So in my opinion, the RBI has played a very important and pragmatic role in the development of fintech in India and the industry at large. A great example of this is the regulations on P2P lending. The RBI was quick to regulate it. So it is actually one of the first few countries where P2P, which is peer-to-peer lending, where basically two unknown strangers across the internet can lend through a platform that's peer-to-peer lending. And the RBI was quick to identify that this is a service which requires regulations, and the regulations were quite stringent to begin with. But over the few years, they realized that, okay, with some checks and boundaries, with decent audits in place, they can relax the norms. And now the purse strings have been relaxed quite significantly, and there are a lot of players now really, and a lot of investors, retail investors, really hitting this as an alternate investment scheme, right? Another regulation, and an important regulation, was the account aggregator regulations. They made it necessary for anyone in possession of important financial information to be regulated. Again, so I think these are good steps. The regulator realized that these are the kind of products which require regulation, and they did that. And if you, in fact, you see the most of the market leaders now are applying for the account aggregator regulation license, so which is great. But on the other hand, I think the RBI has taken a stricter stance with payment aggregators and gateways. I think Bhavna would agree with the sentiment there. So now payment aggregators are now required to be licensed to undertake the activity of payment aggregation. So you cannot do the activity of payment aggregation without being licensed by the RBI. So that's a big step. That wasn't the case. And the definition of a payment aggregator is also extremely wide now to cover entities and e-commerce entities who traditionally would have not been covered as a payment aggregator, right? So I think what the industry understands of what a payment aggregator is and what the regulation says what the payment aggregator is are a little different, and the regulation is slightly wider. We believe that this was done primarily to protect the low-rung merchants who are typically at the mercy of large corporations. So it was probably done with that sense, but that has, in a way, thrown a spoke in the wheel of a really fast-moving industry space over the past 1.5 years. And I also know that there's a big queue in RBI's door to get this license before the deadline of 30th September of this year. The RBI has also shown that they'll not be pushed around, and their regulations are required to be adhered to with the recent ban on MasterCard for flouting the data localization norms. So that's a big change which we're seeing from the regulator. I would think that over the past few decades, if a large corporation would not have adhered to RBI regulations, it'd be probably penalties, fines, compounding and things. But an outright ban with this swiftness is something which has probably taken the industry aback, and really to make the industry realize that, okay, you need to take RBI seriously. And I think so the next point was actually with respect to the regulatory sandboxes which the RBI has also developed. So I think Bhavna has already touched upon that. So that's a great initiative also what's happening, because there are so many innovative payment companies out there who are really ring-fenced within this regulatory sandbox to go ahead and innovate, and that's great. The recent RBI regulations restrict the storage of credit card or debit card information with the payment aggregators and merchants. However, so basically with this restriction came a lot of inconvenience to retail customers. I think everyone would have read about that recently, about how your recurring payments which take place, which there are debits which take place on your cards, which the information has been stored with the merchants, that would have been restricted. However, so I think here again, this is a good example of how the regulator listens to the industry and listens to the pain points. And just before the ban, the RBI has now permitted tokenization of the card on multiple devices and tokenization on card on file. So which basically ensures you have the necessary security, and the retail customers also continue making these seamless payments in relation to recurring online payments. So that's another really good point of what's happened recently. So I think that it's important for the industry and the regulators to remain in constant communication, and I'm confident, I'm an optimist that the industry would succeed in furthering their objectives and the objectives of the economy at large.
Thank you, Anuj. And in fact, the way with the speed with the industry, BFSI segment is growing, we will require many such professionals like you at this point of time. We need more legal brains, more resolution professionals, so to make sure that whatever pendency which is there in IBC gets sorted out. So before we move to Mr. William Block, the US Treasury attaché to India, I just want to summarize about the opportunities which are there in the financial segment. Up till now, whenever we used to speak about BFSI, it was predominantly banking which we used to think. But fact of the matter remains, when we look at the global landscape, it is a financial services company or non-banking financial services company which are ruling the roost, whether it is from asset management, which are bigger than the banking industry in developed countries like US or UK or the Northern Hemisphere, even in the Southeast Asian peers. Similarly, with the general insurance or life insurance, humongous opportunities, and not to mention and forget about the payment infrastructure. Also putting a point, the number of unicorns which are getting created. If you look at this particular year, India is second to what, even maybe second to China, or maybe number one in terms of having these unicorns coming into BFSI space. It only shows the kind of opportunity which we have, and the silent transition which is happening from cash-centric economy to cashless economy. I believe we Indians are adept in for new changes. The way we have seen telecom penetration going up, I am sure similarly about going for UPI, other payment options, going for proper insurance, whether on the life side or the general side, or securing your future through asset management companies is something which Indians are going by every passing day. The awareness is increasing, so is the penetration. So there's a huge opportunity, and this segment will play a very critical role in making sure that we move from a lower income country to middle level income country, and then obviously as a developed world. So with this, I will move to Mr. William Block. US and India has a lot of coordination which is happening on the financial segment. As asset management companies, we are also taking exposure into the US stocks, US financial markets. Similarly, we are receiving a lot of inflows from US institutions into our markets. So over to you, sir. You have been a PhD from Princeton University and also a chartered financial holder. We want to hear from you. What are the best practices which US is following, and how can we collaborate as a country in making sure that we also follow the same path in terms of development, what is there in US? Over to you, Mr. William Block.
Sure. Thank you very much, Amit. And it's nice to meet my fellow panelists. And thanks as well to IACC for organizing this event. I appreciate it. So I'm going to make some higher level remarks. I've been asked to address three specific issues. Number one, what is the nature and the importance of integration among the banking, the insurance, and the payment sectors? Number two, what are opportunities for collaboration and growth between the US and India? And number three, what are my recommendations, both for policy as well as for industry in the financial services space? So my remarks will be centered around those three particular issues. So let me start with the first issue, the integration, the nature and the integration among banking, payment, and insurance sectors. And I'll begin with some higher level remarks and then move more specifically into India. So although banking, insurance, and payments are, of course, distinct markets unto themselves, they're all very closely related and interdependent upon one another, as are other parts of the financial sector that I'm not going to address, like pensions, asset management, alternatives, specialized finance, and so forth. But in one way or another, all of these markets, payments, banking, and insurance, are linked, and they're part of the larger financial ecosystem. Actions in one part of the ecosystem generate a reaction and are transmitted in one way or another to other parts of the ecosystem. Now, what do I mean more concretely by that? Let's start with the payment system. If a country's payment system is working well, properly, people will then hold the optimal level of cash balances in the aggregate. And that means that the banking and the deposit system are going to grow in a sustainable way, in a healthy way, that credit will expand, and that will in turn lead to higher investment, economic growth in the long run, as well as job creation, exactly what we all want to see. Conversely, if a payment system is not functioning as it should be, for example, assume it may be underdeveloped in some way or distorted in some way, then in that case, we would expect probably to see too much cash in circulation. The banking system and deposit creation will not develop as fully as they might, and credit will not expand. Investment, economic growth, and job creation will not be as robust as we would expect. The same principle goes for the banking sector. When the banking sector is working properly, higher rates of investment and capital deepening will result in economic growth will ultimately be higher. Similarly, for the insurance sector, when there is a strong insurance market, that is, there are sound, well-managed firms, there's a good regulatory framework, there's a wide range of products and services that are available to consumers, then risk aversion throughout the economy is going to be reduced. Time horizons, investment horizons will get extended. Consumption and investment behavior will become more stable and more sustainable, and ultimately long-run economic growth and job creation is also going to benefit. In short, everybody wins. So that's the underlying rationale for building and maintaining a strong and healthy financial system. Financial systems are not something that are separate from or distinct from the real economy, that is, households and non-financial corporates. They are almost umbilically tied to the real economy. And when the financial system is working well, the economy has a much higher probability of working well and performing better as well. And if not, then the economy, of course, will perform suboptimally. Financial systems ultimately intermediate the savings throughout the economy and make sure that not only the optimal level of savings, but the use of that savings occurs in the most efficient possible way. Every type of financial market is ultimately connected because money is the most fungible commodity in the entire world. It moves wherever it can be best utilized, and often very quickly. Now, with that larger context, let me make a few comments about India. All three of these markets, payments, insurance, and banking, I think are either in the process of changing right now very significantly, or else are poised, I think, to change very significantly in the relatively near future. Start again with the payment sector, which I think is changing the most rapidly at this point in time. The changes that are now taking place in India's payment space, I think, are nothing less than truly breathtaking. And I realize we don't often use the word breathtaking in the context of discussing financial payments, but I think for economists or people who do the kinds of things that we do for a living, it truly is quite breathtaking and revolutionary when we think about some of the changes that are taking place in the Indians' payment space. Speed is increasing, costs are coming down, accessibility is widening, and quality overall is improving. And it's taking place, again, very rapidly. Consumers are benefiting, financial institutions are benefiting, and India's economy writ large is ultimately benefiting. While India is still very cash intensive relative to many other countries, that cash intensity has come down quite a bit, and I expect that trend to continue in the future. There's an RBI database out there that was unveiled earlier this year that shows a very rapid rise in digital payments in India. India, I believe, now has more digital payments than any other country in the world, including China, which is quite remarkable. There's also a lot happening in the insurance sector. In particular, I would highlight two important developments, recent developments. One is the decision by the government to raise foreign equity caps earlier this year from 49% up to 74%. The second is the IPO that will take place sometime later this year of LIC. These are very good steps, and I commend India's government for taking them. I do think over the longer run, they're going to make a substantial positive difference. The banking sector is also changing, perhaps a bit less visibly than the other sectors, but nonetheless, when we look below the surface, I do think that there are some very important shifts that are potentially coming in the banking sector in the next few years as a result of some other issues that are arising, other developments. And I'll mention just a few of them. One is the entry of big tech into the financial space. Not only payments, but also digital lending is growing quite rapidly. We see potentially in 2022, India's inclusion in global bond indexes that I think has the potential to shake things up quite a bit. There's growing likelihood that starting in 2022, we might really see on a much larger scale than we've seen to this point, a number of Indian firms listing overseas. I think that will be very important. There is growth in alternative and specialized finance, PE and VC in particular. And then finally, there still is potentially at some point the emergence of a corporate bond market in India. I think there's still quite some ways to go, but nonetheless, I think a lot of potential there. There's no reason why India should not have a very vibrant corporate bond market. So I think at some point it's really a question of when that happens rather than whether it happens. So I think we're in the early innings, the early stages of what I think is potentially a very big shakeup in India's financial system and financial services, and a positive paradigm shift, I think. Incumbent banks and incumbent financial institutions are going to be challenged, I think, by some of these new dynamics that are in play. But I think there are going to be many new opportunities, and that India as a whole is going to benefit from many of these changes. Now, the second question I was asked to address, what are opportunities for collaboration between the US and India? Very simply stated, I think there is an extraordinary set of possibilities for collaboration. And like many of my colleagues on the US side, I think that we should do all that we really reasonably can to try and capitalize on those possibilities, to take full advantage of them. The more that the US and India collaborate, I think that is beneficial not only for our countries, but I believe for the world as a whole. So what can we actually do together? We can find ways to promote more trade and investment and to work together on a range of very important financial sector issues. We can work on climate finance. We can work on modernizing the set of global financial rules, which we are already doing, and other areas where we can collaborate. I think there's a lot of room ahead to deepen our trade and investment ties between our countries, a lot of synergies and a lot of good things that could come from that. Of course, the devil is always in the details. Saying that you want a trade agreement, for example, doesn't make it happen. It takes a lot of hard work and compromise. The same for the other issues: investment, climate, global rule writing, financial architecture, all those issues where we can potentially collaborate and are collaborating, but it takes a lot of hard work. I think there's no doubt that from our side of the table, we would very much like to see more trade and investment between the US and India. What about more specific issues? What about payments, banking, and insurance? What are we doing in that space? And the answer is that we're talking regularly with our Indian counterparts in the finance ministry, the Reserve Bank, SEBI, and other places about all of these issues. And without going into all the details of our discussions, I think it's safe to say that both our governments recognize the importance of talking about these issues, of finding ways to collaborate, and the benefits that ultimately we will realize from greater collaboration. We have a number of different venues in which we collaborate. One is known as the Economic and Financial Partnership, the EFP. We meet annually at the ministerial level. So the Secretary of the Treasury meets with the Minister of Finance. The Chairman of the Fed meets with the Governor of the RBI. And I expect our next set of discussions to take place relatively soon. We have a financial regulatory dialogue that takes place regularly. I work as an attaché, here in India. I'm posted in New Delhi. I work regularly with our counterparts in the government, counterparts in India's private sector, with many US companies. I would note that Treasury has only about 9 or 10 of these positions around the world in total. So it's a very small number. The fact that we have one of these positions here in India, New Delhi, I think speaks to the importance of the US-Indian relationship to the US Treasury. We also work with our Indian friends in multilateral venues, in the Financial Stability Board in Basel, in the multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and elsewhere. We have excellent communication with the Ministry of Finance, the Reserve Bank, and others. We have very good and frank discussions with them. I will be candid and say that we don't agree on all the issues. We do have some disagreements. We're very candid. But we hold these conversations in the spirit of friendship, of partnership, sharing information and perspectives. And I think both sides approach our conversations in exactly that way. I'd also note that I spend a lot of my time here in New Delhi working with US financial institutions, commercial banks, credit card companies, the whole gamut of firms. And I hear a lot about the issues that they're facing here in India as well. So I think that's an excellent set of relationships. The final question, the third question I'll briefly address. What are my recommendations for industry and for policy? Well, for industry, I wouldn't presume to tell all of you that are listening in about what your great companies ought to be doing. You know far better than I do what you ought to be doing. I'd simply say that you should continue doing exactly what you're doing already, which is constantly upgrading your companies, improving your competitiveness, innovating, striving to be more competitive, to be more profitable. I would say on the policy side, what are our jobs as policymakers? Our job fundamentally is to help to create the conditions, the market conditions that will ultimately help you to do your jobs better on your end, and also to ensure that the markets are operating as they're supposed to operate. In general, my view is that markets work best when they're allowed to work on their own. That doesn't mean that there aren't some occasions when interventions or corrections are necessary. Financial systems do need regulation. They do need some oversight. Over the years, we've all seen examples where a financial system or parts of a financial system overshot in one way or another. We want to make sure that risks don't become too concentrated, that strong capital and liquidity buffers are in place, that good corporate governance practices are followed, that transparency, financial transparency is always available to people, and so on. In my opinion, it's best generally for policymakers to keep a light touch where possible, but also when necessary to make sure that you keep your hands on the steering wheel. At US Treasury, we believe very strongly that financial systems can make a very vital contribution to the real economy, and that financial systems can make a real difference in living standards over the long run. So to go back to the characterization I made at the outset, a good financial ecosystem can help to advance other economic goals, growth and employment in particular. Some of the principles that we argue for at Treasury in our conversations with our Indian friends include the importance of openness. Economies that are open tend over the long run to perform much better than economies that are not open. We advocate for competition. Competition is necessary for economic efficiency and for economic growth. Market development and market infrastructure, the development of new tools that can help the economy and the financial system to grow, is another area we focus on. Implementation of best international practices, whether they're Basel standards or they're OECD standards, is another priority. And we also argue for what we call a level playing field. That is, we want competition to be fair. We want the markets to operate on a fair and equal basis. We want our companies to have a fair chance at gaining access to the market and competing on an equal basis with everyone else. So those are our principles. We'll continue to advocate for our principles. I expect that our two teams, the US team and the Indian team, are going to have some more high-level engagement with one another relatively soon. I'm talking now about our ministries of finance and our central banks. We're going to continue to discuss many of these issues. We know our Indian counterparts very well. We have very high regard for them. I think the Prime Minister Modi has a really strong economics team. They're very highly respected in the Treasury Department and the US government writ large. So we're looking forward to our next set of discussions later this year, either in October or November, I anticipate. So let me stop there and just say thank you again for organizing this very important conference.
Thanks, William, for your nice words, and we can only say on behalf of the industry that we are making rapid strides, trying to have the best practices which are being followed by economies like US. And you know, it is like a music to our ears, thinking, you know, hearing from you about the kind of rapid strides which have been made on the payment side or on the insurance side. Also take your view that at least in the corporate bond market is something where we need to have much more liquidity than what we have. On the responsible investing, which Anuj also touched upon, we as an asset management industry are giving a lot of credence to the ESG theme, means companies which are economically friendly, socially responsible, and most importantly, have a right kind of a governance practice. And that is the reason as an asset management company, we have signed UNPRI, which is a responsible way of investing, and also trying to follow whatever global standards are. So we are very, very confident, given the way government is supporting, government of the day is supporting the financial sector as a whole, or regulator, while at times might be erring on the side of a little more stringent, but are definitely, you know, for the benefit of the Indian consumer, Indian investor, are moving in a right direction, and companies and SRAs from their end are making sure that we are bringing the best of the practices, SOPs, and best disclosure norms as far as to gain confidence of our investors. There is a lot of collaboration happening for different set of financial companies, and US is a benchmark which we are trying to follow. So we are very confident in the days to come, the collaboration is only going to increase. From the asset management side, we are also ensuring that US as a financial market, we are providing strategies and solutions for our Indian domestic investor. And recently we launched a US dedicated fund where we mobilized around $150 million, though a small amount, but a step in the right direction, and lot many Indian investors are looking for US as an investment destination. So hopefully in the days to come, we will see much more collaboration, you know, we following mutually the best practices to be done, and learning from each other is something which we like to have. And thanks a ton for all the, you know, the importance and the seriousness which you give to our relationship and our country. Look forward to keep on learning from you in the days to come. Thanks a lot. We will like to go back to Dr. Bhasin. If you are around, maybe a parting words from you. I will also like to take this opportunity of thanking all the participants for listening to us. I will only appeal, please explore the potential and the possibility which we offer on different platforms, whether on the asset management side or on the insurance side, and more importantly on the payment side. And the true way for us as an economy to grow is from moving from cash-centric economy to a cashless economy. Thanks a lot. Over back to you, Administrator.
Thank you, Mr. Gupta. Thank you.